Hi, this is Paul. I was gone most of this week, but I had a chance to do a bunch of reading, which was awesome. And I actually did listen to the Joe Rogan, Douglas Murray, Dave Smith conversation. I wasn't going to listen to it at all, but one of you left a comment about, oh, I'm waiting for your response to that. And I thought, I don't know that I'm going to watch it at all. I'm not a regular watcher of Joe Rogan anyway. Usually I'll maybe watch something if it's sort of connected with Christianity, like the Wes Huff thing, or if Jordan Peterson's on it, or somebody else that we usually cover. The much anticipated Jonathan Peugeot appearance on the Joe Rogan Experience. I don't know if we'll ever see that, but I didn't even know who Dave Smith was. I got as I mentioned before, I got a month subscription on YouTube of Sam Harris, and I listened to Sam's comments on that. That was interesting. The Sam Harris stuff's ended. Anyway, maybe I'll talk a little bit of that as we get into this. So I was gone. I was gone for the week, and I had a little bit of time, so I listened to this conversation. And what's interesting to me about this conversation are a few things. Okay, my sound is too low. Guess my sound isn't too low. Okay. Ostensibly on the surface, this conversation is either about whether or not we should listen to experts, to what degree should we outsource our cognition to people like Joe Rogan, and who's right with respect to the wars in the Ukraine and Gaza. That's ostensibly what this conversation is about. And it's caused all kinds of, I mean, it's just repeat on this thing. Okay. So Sam Harris's take on it is, oh, we should listen to experts. He sort of sided with Douglas Murray because Murray's a friend and because Murray's so articulate, but he also sort of sided with Dave Smith because he kind of leans in that direction in terms of yes, no on who's the baddie. Now, this gets into my whole first filter video that I made a little while ago, because just like with the atheist Christian debates, just like with Democrat Republican debates, just like with even debates within a church, you can have the Christian Reformed Church, how you stand on women in office, how you stand on same-sex marriage, and what happened at Synods 22 to 24. On all of these things, people sort of have a first filter where there's sort of a bias that through which they see everything else, and that interpretive filter sort of holds all the way down. Now, of course, what's interesting about this is depending on the felt hegemony in the culture, Douglas Murray is a friend of Joe Rogan, and I'm sure if I dug it up, I could find all sorts of clips of Douglas Murray talking about getting beyond the gatekeepers and, let's say, populism, common sense, all of this stuff. But now, sort of, if the issue is the other way around, Douglas Murray comes on there, and he just basically begins saying, you've had more people take the other side of the side other than Douglas Murray has. The side, you've had too many people talk about the other side of this, and Rogan's like, well, I wasn't really picking people for that, but yeah. In other words, your platform is so large, you owe the certain side a responsibility, and I'd really love you to promote X on your platform or something on your platform. I can't say X because that's Twitter now. And I get this even in my own small ways sometimes. Some people in the Christian Reformed Church are sore at me because with all of the fights between Synod 22 and 2024, I didn't come out on a certain side to pursue a particular end in the Christian Reformed Church. The other side isn't always happy with me because I might not be the type of Christian Reformed minister that they think should have as big a voice as I have, which I don't really think is all that big. But on and on and on we go. So Then we get into the whole gatekeepers conversation. We get into the whole rationalism conversation. We get into the whole facts and evidence conversation. We just go down, down, down in these filters. And so much of the conversation was just sort of a debate back and forth, a fairly loose debate. I think overall, I tend to think Douglas Murray won. Murray is a tremendously articulate guy, but I don't consider myself an expert on either of those wars, and so I'm not gonna see. This is another thing that sort of captures my attention, is that you have these issues that arise from certain groups, and those groups sort of want to pull you through the screen or the camera and say, you must take a stand, you must do this, you must meet us in this certain way for this certain thing, and if you don't do that, then you're what? Damned, then you're a bad person, then you're... And you can just tick off how many of these sort of all-consuming ideas or positions, usually political positions now. And the idea is that your voice must join all of these other voices. And if we can join all of these other voices, then we can move the needle in democracy a certain amount in order to affect the change we want to have affected. And quite frankly, I'm very distrustful of those narratives. I've posted a couple of my recent sermons, partly because I didn't have anything else for the channel, and the sound is better, and so it's like, oh, I thought the sermon went well. We'll see what people think of the sermon, and people have thoughts. Rogan had a whole number of thoughts on one of my sermons recently, and shared them in the comments. So there's that. But I'm also thinking about this because, of course, I'm working on my Easter sermon. And there's always a little bit more pressure for the Easter sermon, even though I don't know that at Living Stones there'll be another soul that will be in church more than what is usually in church. And I don't know that I'm going to have a rough draft this week, because I don't even think my sermon is ready enough for a rough draft. Maybe I'll do one tomorrow. I don't know. Sermons are things that I work on, and then I sit, and then I work on, and then I let them sit, because as they sit in my brain continues to work on them, and I think they get better that way, generally speaking. So I mull. But one of the things I picked up on, so I had a device with me, and at the hotel we were staying with, just the week before we went down there, they announced that Death Valley was going to have a power outage for a day. And so there'd be no Wi-Fi, there'd be no air conditioning. So my wife and I, we just decided we're going to sit by the pool and read. So that's what we did. We sat by the pool and we read. And the device I had a very limited number of my Kindle books on it. But the books that I brought, the books that were on it, were quite good. And I really enjoyed reading a bunch out of those books. And I caught this one section from Niles Ferguson's book, Doom, The Politics of Catastrophe. I just recently had a conversation with Jordan Hall about apocalypse. And this section caught my eye. Geneva is just over 900 miles from Lisbon as the crow flies. It's doubtful that anyone in the Swiss city felt even the slightest tremor on November 1, 1755, the day that the Portuguese capital was devastated by an earthquake and tsunami waves. And yet the news of the disaster, this is on a chapter on networks, the news of the disaster spread much further than the tremors of Earth, thanks to the network of publication and correspondence that had evolved in the Western world in the 2 centuries since the Reformation, when Geneva had been the capital of Calvinism. François-Marie Arouet, better known by his nom de plume, Voltaire, was already a long way down the path to religious skepticism by 1755. That was why he was in Geneva. Louis XIV had banned him. But the Lisbon The Lisbon earthquake crystallized Voltaire's revulsion against all those branches of philosophy that sought to reconcile humanity to such apparent arbitrary catastrophes. In his uncharacteristically passionate, I can't read French, poem to the disaster of Lisbon, Voltaire took issue as bitterly as he and his publisher dared with the optimistic theodicy of German polymath Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. Now, I think Nathan Jacob is working on releasing a book that he's writing on Leibniz, so it's interesting, and he's going to talk about that on his channel. So I'm going to follow that. Maybe I'll have a conversation with him about it, because I don't know a lot about Leibniz. We live in the best of all possible worlds, and the English poet Alexander Pope, whatever is right, which struck him as intolerably complacent. Heaven on our sufferings casts a pitying eye. That's right, you answer, the eternal cause rules not by partial, but by general laws. Yet, in this direful chaos, you'd compose a general bliss from individuals' woes. O worthless bliss, in injured reason's sight, with faltering voice you cry, what is right. But how conceive a God, the source of love, who on man lavishes blessings from above? Then would the race with various plagues confound? Can mortals penetrate his views confound? Voltaire, of course, is one of the sharpest pens in the Enlightenment and did a lot to sort of undermine the assumptions of the world that was quickly passing away. The poem precipitated a heated response, not least from Jean-Jacques Rousseau. This in turn prompted Voltaire to write his ironical masterpiece Candide, or Optimism, 1759, in which the eponymous hero, accompanied by the Leibniz character Dr. Pangloss and an Anabaptist sailor, witnesses the destruction of Lisbon. The impact of the Lisbon earthquake on Voltaire and Rousseau, not to mention the Prussian philosopher Immanuel Kant, who wrote 3 separate texts on the subject, testified to the power of social networks in the 18th century. Social networks, of course, long predated the Enlightenment. Egyptian pharaohs had them in the 14th century BC. The Silk Roads had connected the Roman and Chinese empires. Christianity and later Islam, too, created enormous and enduring social networks that extended far beyond the Judaic and Arab societies where they had originated. The power structure of Renaissance Florence was based on complex familial networks. There were also networks of navigators, explorers, yada, yada, yada. And the Reformation was, in many ways, a networked revolution made by interconnected groups of religious reformers all over northwestern Europe, whose capacity to spread their Protestant message had been decisively increased by the spread of the printing press beginning in the late 15th century. Still, the Enlightenment network stands out, not so much for its geographical range, 70% of Voltaire's correspondents were French, as for the quality of the content that was shared on it. In particular, the connections between the continent and the hotbed of genius that was Scotland after the defeat of the Jacobites in 1746 were especially important for the development of the most important ideas of the modern age. Adam Smith today is better remembered for The Wealth of Nations, 1776, than for his earlier The Theory of Moral Sentiments, published the same year as Candide. But they are equally important works. Let us suppose, wrote Smith in a remarkable passage in Part 3 of The Theory, that the great empire of China, with all its myriads of inhabitants, was suddenly swallowed up by an earthquake. And let us consider how a man of humanity in Europe, who had no sort of connection with that part of the world, would be affected upon receiving intelligence of the dreadful calamity. He would, I imagine, first of all, express very strongly his sorrow for the misfortune of that unhappy people. He would make many melancholy reflections upon the precariousness of human life and the vanity of all the labors of man, which could thus be annihilated in a moment. He would too, perhaps, if he was a man of speculation, enter into many seasons concerning the effects which the disaster might produce upon the commerce of Europe and the trade and business of the world in general. And when all of this fine philosophy was over, when all of these human sentiments had once been fairly expressed, He would pursue his business or his pleasure, take his repose or his diversion with the same ease and tranquility as if no such accident had happened. So I was reading this about the same time I was working my way through that 3-hour plus conversation between the two, and I thought, all of the chatter, how much does it move? Doesn't move nothing. Move something. Will it move anything? I don't know. This was a profound insight, in some measures anticipating the Tuchel-Stalin distinction between a tragedy and a mere statistic. The most frivolous disaster which could befall himself would occasion a more real disturbance, argued Smith. If he was to lose a little finger tomorrow, he would not sleep tonight, but provided he never saw them, he would snore for the most profound security over the ruin of 100 million of his brethren. That word right there, his brethren. Tom Holland is over in the back saying, how did they become his brethren? What is this universality of this strange religion that we are promoting and articulating and debating on Joe Rogan? The destruction of that immense multitude seems plainly an object less interesting to him than his paltry misfortune of his own. And Smith is exactly right. Let's say he crushes his finger in a little accident. He'll be far more concerned with his little finger than he will with the swallowing up of all of China. Human beings are this way. Smith then asked an important ethical question. To prevent, therefore, this paltry misfortune to himself, would a man of humanity be willing to sacrifice the lives of 100 million of his brethren, provided he had never seen them? This, of course, gets to some of these strange tests that they did about, are you willing to sort of shock a stranger? Under what terms are you willing to shock a stranger? And, you get trolley tests and all these kinds of things. When we are always so much more deeply affected by whatever concerns ourselves than whatever concerns other men? What is it which prompts the generous upon occasions and the mean upon others to sacrifice their own interests to the great interests of others? The answer he gave was not quite satisfactory. It is not the soft power of humanity. It is not that feeble spark of benevolence which nature has lightened up in the human heart, that is thus capable of counteracting the strongest impulse of self-love. It is a strong power, a more forcible power, which exerts upon itself such occasions. It is reason, principle, conscience, the inhabitants of the breast, the man within, the great judge and arbiter of our conduct. It is not the love of our neighbor, it is not the love of mankind, which upon occasions prompts us to the practice of those divine virtues. It is a stronger love, a more powerful attraction, which generally takes place upon such occasions, the love of what is honorable and noble, of the grandeur and dignity and superiority of our own characters. Now, Ferguson, of course, says, I don't know if I'm buying this. And I get Ferguson's point. I was listening to The Rest is History. They had a series on Hitler at Munich, and then Hitler and the invasion of Poland. And of course, what all politicians do is sort of, especially in democracies, is sort of ask themselves, what really will the people of my country sacrifice for? And given the wars in the Pax Americana, the Vietnam War, the Korean War, the two Gulf Wars, the Afghan War, and many, many other military actions. Of course, most presidents will figure out if they want to accomplish certain ends or achieve certain postures towards security. Just make sure if we can keep American boots off the ground and make sure we can conduct these things with drone strikes and missiles from airplanes. You don't want to go back through that Black Hawk 1 thing. You don't want to do that. Or the Marines in Beirut. You don't want to do that. And see, already for a number of you, if I say Black Hawk Down, you'll say, that was a movie. And if I say the Marines in Beirut, a whole bunch of you will not have any idea what on earth I'm talking about those Marines who were killed when they were in Beirut. A disaster such as Smith's hypothetical Chinese earthquake, perhaps he would have chosen the real Portuguese earthquake had Voltaire not been so upset by it, ought to elicit sympathy even in distant Edinburgh. For to be entirely unmoved would be a shaming kind of solipsism. But I would argue that this shaming kind of solipsism is so often the normal state of humanity, because there's the presentation of the concern, there's the speed of the concern, and the question of what network that concern is in the midst of. Douglas Murray quotes Daniel Patrick Moynihan by making the comment that to one degree or another, the level of the... I should find that quote. AI is really good for really fuzzy searches. Moahans Law. The amount of violations of human rights in a country is always an inverse function of the amount of complaints about human rights violations heard from there. The greater the number of complaints being aired, the better protected are human rights in that country. This observation suggests that societies with robust protections for human rights tend to have more open vocal complaints than perceived violations, precisely because the culture and institutions allow and even encourage such criticism. Conversely, in societies where human rights are routinely violated, such complaints are rare, often because they are suppressed. Moynihan's insights are frequently cited in discussions of American culture, where the prevalence of public debate and protest is seen not as an evidence of crisis, but as a sign of a healthy, open society that protects the rights to dissent. Not just the rights to dissent, but the sense of what pinches. Every day people die. Now, that isn't to take away the catastrophe that every war is. And then, of course, the Dave Smith, Douglas Murray debate was who's in the wrong or the right. And again, it's almost like there's this little imaginary board up in the sky, and who's in the wrong and who's in the right. Well, this is important. It's almost as if there's, dare we say, a God who judges, that this God will call to account the nations, the leaders of the nations, and to one degree or another, our participation to whatever degree we are involved in the actions of our nations. Now again, once you start sort of pulling this thing open, you begin to see, wow, this gets really complicated really fast. And I think one way or another you have to recognize that, well, the Bible has everything to do with this. There was a, what was his name? I don't remember his name. It was a guy from a splinter Mormon group that was serving time in a Texas prison for statutory rape for, in his mind, marrying a junior high girl as one of his wives. And so what this guy would do, I must have had some wealthy backers, is he would print these. So he was so LDS theology is very much a theology of a religion of prophets. So he styled himself a prophet, and he would send out these bound books of his prophecies. And for some this is long before YouTube. For some strange reason, living stones would get these books. And I'd get these books and we'd never get mail of this sort. I'd get these books in the mail and I'd open it. It'd just be full of prophecies to the nation. And he'd have all these prophecies against this nation and prophecies against that nation, sort of styled on what you can read in the minor prophets or the major prophets in the Old Testament. And of course, the nations are sort of considered as these collective bodies. And so they rise or fall and are judged. And this is pretty clearly a habit that we've picked up from the Bible and the instruments in the Bible. And what's amazing to me about it is that we, despite all sorts of sort of pushing the Bible away and not caring about it, we just continue to practice and think in this way. You know, the whole tariff business has caused a whole number of examples of this again, where we talk about America and China as if they're these giant creatures. And these giant creatures have debts and obligations, moral obligations towards one another. And again, I'm naming this. I'm not saying they don't. But the imaginary way that we all carry on in this manner and how we're so completely blind to it is striking. And so debate as if, well, someone's going to be held to account. And, you know, has America been held to account for foolish adventuring in wars? Was America held to account in the Vietnam War? Well, yeah, in some ways. You could certainly see it that way, and that's a very handy way of seeing it. And again, I'm not skeptical about that way of thinking. I'm more surprised at people that look at Jonathan Peugeot and say, "Oh, he's all wet," and then talk this way, because in their talking this way, they're basically demonstrating exactly what he keeps pointing out to them. That in some ways these nation states are like these giants upon the earth that do things, and we think in these terms, and we judge them in these terms, and we find ourselves somehow participating in these massive things and these grand debates like David Smith and Charles Murray. Is it a grand debate when it's basically on a show, which, according to the person that hosts the show, should really just sort of be considered? These are friends talking as if at a bar. And there's a degree of performative contradiction when both Sam Harris, who of course is doing exactly the same thing, and Douglas Murray, who pretty much does exactly the same thing, on one hand says, the Joe Rogan show isn't a place where we should get our news because we don't have gate-kept experts there. But of course he goes there, and of course, because he raised the expert question, Dave Smith and Joe Rogan are going to ask Douglas Murray, are you an expert on this? But of course, once you claim to be an expert, now suddenly the entire context and apparatus of expertise will be called into question, and that first filter effect will once again be known, because of course an expert is someone who has a lot of footnotes and agrees with me. I started listening to the telepathy tapes. I started listening to that because I wasn't able to participate in Neil Daedalus's regathering of some of the people who participated in the Connecticut estuary. So I listened to that not estuary conversation, and it came up there, and a number of people have mentioned it before. So I thought, well, I'll start listening to them, and we'll see if anything grabs me from it. There are a number of thoughts that grab me. Again, I'm not grabbed by sort of the exposure of the materialist worldview and its collapse. I've seen plenty of that already. I think it's going to continue to collapse. It is remarkable in the illustration and demonstration of how a mother and a disabled child can, at a very deep level and in some surprising ways, in highly unusual cases, share a degree of cognition that can be demonstrated and tested, at least to the common eye. Pretty remarkable. It's also interesting to me that on one hand, we can get quite excited about this, when for the most part, a lot of the payoff of this is dispelled by a pen and paper. The child can know the number that the mother is thinking, whereas for most of us, we can simply say the number and have the number said back. In other words, the disability is a fascinating element of the mystery of the conversation. And it's a fascinating element of the bond. I was talking about affordances of constraint. This seems to be a very remarkable affordance of a rather dramatic and, in often cases, painful constraint. And so it is really remarkable, and I'll probably listen to the whole thing all the way through. Because I'm working on my Easter sermon, I thought maybe Glenn would help me out, because this is basically his Easter sermon. He had Joe Rogan and Jordan Peterson on the thumbnail, so that's sure to get clicks. And he's talking about resurrection. And I really enjoyed, especially the setup to this video.
On Joe Rogan, Joe said this about Christianity.
I know a lot of Christians, or hardcore Christians.
Because Joe Rogan in Christianity is the new Jordan Peterson in Christianity.
The nicest people you'll ever meet in your life. So it does work. Right? Like, if you do live like a Christian and you do follow the principles of Christ, you will have a richer, more love-filled life. So it is true.
Now, again, caring. And you can see care underneath this Adam Smith observation. Do we really care about 1 million Chinese who get swallowed up? Do we really care about the great atrocities of the 20th century? Again, Jonathan Peugeot's observation about Hiroshima and Auschwitz. And it's interesting how this Ferguson puts this in a chapter on networking. And the telepathy tapes are really all about a tiny little, really thick network of mother and child. And in one case, can the child read the father's mind? No. How is touch involved? The touch being involved was so interesting, because we had to finally break down and pay a landscaper. So if anybody'd like to make a contribution to Living Stones to help with the landscaping, be much appreciated. So we finally had to pay a landscaper, because our 91-year-old father of a 63-year-old disabled man, who more or less had been doing our landscaping for the last number of years, are no longer up to the task. And part of this is because the 91-year-old and his wife now have to have some in-home nursing support. And the disabled son, by virtue of his mental illness, really had to move to another place. And it's been interesting, because the disabled son, did some time in the psych ward for a little while, came out much, much better, much more level, but he's back in group home. And it's been interesting, because without the father's agency sort of worked through the son can't really cut the grass. And there's some nagging involved there. But this is where our networks are mysterious. Because I noted that we had paid the son a nominal sum for years. The sum was set by his father. The son's on disability, permanent disability. And so the amount was set so that it would make sure that the son would stay below the Social Security mandates. So he could get a little bit of extra money by doing this work at the church. And of course, it was a great deal for the church, because although there were other complexities that we had to deal with, the job was never that well done. And the older they got, the worse the job would get. That's now led to the fact that they just couldn't keep up at all. And now that the Son is no longer living with the Father, he just can't do the job at all. And so there's this subtle network that runs through us. And it does run through us civilizationally. When Dave Smith and Douglas Murray, I don't know anything about Dave Smith's religious convictions or not, but Douglas Murray we know a little bit about. You know, little skeptical and fuzzy about belief in God, but they sure do want to have a theological debate within what I think is ostensibly and fundamentally a religious imaginary about whether or not what the politics should be around Israel and Gaza. And part of what struck me about that entire debate was everyone involved just seems completely blind to the context of it. Now, I did listen to Sam Harris and Tom Holland. And again, listening to Sam Harris's commentary on the debate with Dave Smith and Douglas Murray on Joe Rogan, again, as Tom Holland points out again and again and again, the Enlightenment made this universal. So Voltaire, on one hand, sort of says God just keeps getting pushed higher and higher, further and further out. For many centuries, someone could easily have imagined, well, the destruction of Lisbon was condemnation by God. Now, exactly for what and how so, that was always greatly debated, if not vague. But when it comes time for even very serious Christians in the 21st century, when there's a tornado that wipes out a church or a town, it's very interesting to see how Christians react to that as compared to, say, what they did in past centuries, and certainly how, let's say, Israel and the Bible would react to, just reading the book of Judges, the calamities that would befall them, and how the calamities that would befall Israel were functions of their failure to keep the covenant, a la the book of Deuteronomy. And so Glenn Scrivener's video here is very interesting because Glenn's basically making the point there's a whole lot below the waterline. And to whatever degree Joe Rogan is or isn't thinking about himself as a Christian, how we define that word, whether you have a Christian civilization, etc., it's out there.
Right?
Christianity is actually very attractive to a lot of people right now. Joe's story is a lot of people's story, but at the moment, Joe and others feel on the outside of faith. There's a big part of them that wants to believe and a big part of them that they feel they cannot believe. Here's how Joe puts it.
But you have to submit to this concept that this guy was the child of God who came down to earth, let himself be crucified, came back from the dead, explained a bunch of stuff for people, and then said, all right, see you when I come back.
I think Joe's put his finger on how many people feel. Maybe it's how you feel. I'm not surprised if that's the case. In a lot of ways, it's Christians who have been giving the impression that this is how faith works. It's the Indiana Jones view of faith. You know the scene. Indy is faced with a chasm. To shut your eyes to reality, put your hand on your heart, and force yourself to take a step that looks ridiculous. This view of faith is nonsense, but it is widespread. It's the Buddy the Elf view of faith. You know, a bunch of jaded New Yorkers need to help Santa's sleigh fly out of Central Park. How will they work up a sense of crisp?
And of course, I've long noted that Hollywood movies, in terms of their deployment of theological sensibilities and ideas, far more effective than preachers.
Christmas spirit by singing Santa Claus is Coming to Town. And the spirit meter on the sleigh goes from 8 to 88, which, I don't know, I'm just thinking now, is that a nod to Back to the Future, 88? Anyway, just a thought. And then when the most jaded of all New Yorkers, Buddy's dad, joins in, whooshka, the power of belief is enormous.
And Christmas is saved.
But the question is, how do you do it? Do you just summon up belief like Alice in Wonderland? She forces her for thinking that, and other people.
Like got lots of movie clips. It's interesting too because Sam Harris then gets asked about the whole Santa Claus thing, and I don't lie to my children. And it's funny because, to what degree Sam Harris and I have something in common. My parents never taught me that Santa Claus was real either. We always knew that, well, at least, but by the time we got old enough to wonder where the presents came from, we had a pretty young age. We had a pretty good idea. And so I don't know. I didn't feel gypped. And although, again, even though my parents never told me anything about Santa, and anybody who knew my father would know, he said disparaging Protestant things about Santa himself on a regular basis, which now makes myself and my sister and my mother chuckle. Glenn is right that belief just doesn't really sort of work this way. None of these networks that we have or assumptions that we have really totally sort of work in this way. And we're at this point where, okay, so they have a big debate on Joe Rogan about Gaza and Ukraine. Are either of these things going to move the needle? Who knows? But everybody involved certainly feels like they're doing meaningful work. How we believe, what we know, it's really quite a mystery. But if there's one aspect that isn't mysterious, well, it is mysterious, but seems the truest aspect, is that we do it together. And whether we're verbal, talking, or you've got a tiny group of nonverbal autistic children that have been able to type on things, and so they have sort of this weird mind meld with their moms. There is something to us together, being, doing, thinking, talking, moving, wondering, drama. This Substacker, Matt Whiteley, I've just basically noted most of his titles, taking a swipe at Peterson and Vervaeke and Peugeot, and then Jonathan sort of wading in with him. I think part of the reason that all three, and especially Peugeot, got so much traction is that they were able to put their finger on and help us see something that's always been there. And it's so often the case that, again, just go all the way back to Plato, so often learning feels so much like remembering because it's always sort of been there. And we've always sort of suspected it was there. Well, I'm not entirely satisfied with this video. I told my wife this morning, it's really bad when I go somewhere and I have hours upon hours to read and really enjoy the reading and have so many thoughts. And, like, again, the electricity was off. There was no internet there. It was really wonderful. I could just read and think. But I can't. I start talking to my wife about this stuff, and first her eyes glaze over. Then after a while, she sort of looks at me with an annoyed way, like, I said, this is the kinds of things I talk about on my videos. It's the kinds of things I have to get off my chest. They're the kinds of things that are so hopelessly unorganized. I don't know why anybody cares to watch them and think with me, but I really appreciate that you do. because it's better than thinking alone, as we can see by every other point I've made in this video. So hopefully I'll get a chance to go back over some things. Of course, getting back after a week like this is really painful because the Easter sermon isn't really far enough along even to make a rough draft today. So no rough draft on Saturday. Sorry, but I guess I really don't have any cause to apologize for the amount of content I put out on my channel. So leave a comment.